This is chapter 10 in Crowned Countenance. This chapter is about Vlad's children. Bela Lugosi's dead takes place in Lake Elsinore, which was a military vamp nest prison, military boarding house, maze of the underworld, tar pits, and an earth breach contained. Lake Elsinore boarding house was a gigantic maze of hellish things. The walls had secret staircases and hidden doors all throughout the complex. So you had to blueprint that into your muscle memory, for one, to get through the complexities of the mission there. There were also time walls within these structures, as this place was very supernatural and had been overseen and architecturally blueprinted in 5D hundreds of years ago. So once we thought that we had gotten the hidden stairs, the doors down, and got to the other end of this complex, another obstacle would pop up, making you go back to the beginning, like its own labyrinth or its own maze, with all the floors and doors and windows and secret staircases to the beginning, and then start over to perfect it and go through it again like a loop. And then to not be harmed while you're doing this, or forget what you did the last time, as there was many evil agents implanted within this complex and compound. And these people and these entities would be covering their tracks and stalking you throughout this complex too, with whatever means necessary they had to perpetuate their secret hidden activities. Because these things were like cockroaches going through this compound and this complex. So it became structurally imperative to complete this mission, because the end result of it would have been catastrophic for that area and for the state. So there's many secret hidden activities that were going on there, nefarious things, a lot of things with the boys that were there, and the evil overseers and the handlers there. They were making sure that their agendas were presumably airtight, but they weren't as presumably airtight and powerful as they thought they were. Because evil always tries to do this, and it always tries to cover up its tracks, but eventually all things backlash on it. It crumbles, it falls, and everything gets exposed to the light. And it is a slap in the face and a sore reality when that happens, but it's epic when that happens every time. And I never got sick of that at all. So all this getting exposed over time marked a lot of progress. And then you can map out like what mistakes these cults and these groups do, because a lot of them are similar in their behaviors and patterns together. And then you can map out their own algorithms and probabilities and use it against them, because that's what they do when they observe and study us. Because God too is always watching. So you go to the highest source and ask for guidance and direction up there in the heavenlies to be able to encounter and navigate and slice through with precision accuracy, like an arrow, these evil structures. There were many boys taken here and programmed. They would be taken into the basement where the rituals were, and other ballrooms where the most hypnotic and brainwashing events occurred. And many boys tried to escape through windows and rooms and exits, but they always seemed to be found and then brought back to a different location of the complex and reprogrammed to confuse them as if they had always been there in that particular spot. And say they would go to one area to start out with, and then the next room they'd be moved into wouldn't have a window, and the door would be in a different place, and then the door would open up into a whole different community. And they did that continually and mapped it out and brain mapped every single boy that was taken to this place. And many became fatigued through this process and malnourished. They got disoriented. They slept longer in their bunk beds, and then they gave in to their flesh and didn't resist as much. And also medications don't help this at all when you're like being trapped in a spider web and you don't quite realize it yet. You have to act fast, otherwise it gets worse and worse every day. And then you dig yourself deeper, and then you have to get rescued or have an outside source come in and rescue you. So Vlad Dracul bloodlines were interdimensionals and body hoppers. And there was a son of Vlad there. We called him Bela Lugosi. And this thing was like a short and conniving, ugly little guy with black hair, greasy black hair, and he thought he was the most powerful surviving vampire that ever lived. And Vlad's picture was also on the walls in this place and in dining rooms, and just huge paintings that they lit candles to every night. And the military factions were so strange here. And the military faction men that maybe weren't compromised that went into this facility eventually did become compromised, and their minds were malleable and weak, and they became subservient to this demonstrable faction that had already supplanted itself and then took over these military officials, which then took over the boys, who was like a assembly line that was coming through there. And soul scalping went on there. They were used and used others as human puppets eventually at every point here. They had certain checkpoints and procedures and protocols that they had instilled here, and it was just a straight up cult. So they had professional recruiting scouts as their fronts, making these programs seem legitimate and stately and honorable. But the things that went on behind closed doors was a different story, and why the NSA keeps tabs on this place for so long and other places like this for so many reasons, because they're so wrong on so many levels. And the basement was the worst place. That was a sacrificial feeding area, and victims, mainly children, were taken there through entrances and a tunnel and then devoured for decades. And the top echelon, the most brainwashed students, were sent down there to observe and encouraged to participate, which, if they did, completely broke most of them, and that was called breaking the threshold. And then it goes into other inner circles. When the mission was successful and all the secret passages, entrances, exits, doors, windows, fronts, and overlay systems collapsed along with the navigational systems and shifting, I don't even know how to describe this, shifting dimensional inlay systems with the stairwells particularly, and the hallways that worked like a turnkey time wall operating system modalis machine. The hallways in the place itself kind of worked like clockwork. And the sliders, the time sliders, I called them, that seemed to just be like lurking and stalking us in the hallways every time we went through this place, they were getting trapped in between quantum spaces, whatever you want to call them, void spaces, or vacuum spaces, and then sealed off forever from the structure. And that was our intent and our point in mapping out the system and doing it, and going in with stealth and precision and speed and accuracy, because we knew that there were so many in there and so many like trip systems and radars that you would immediately be found out. So a lot of times what happens is that evil sets up these structures, and then they set up so much to entrap others that it eventually backfires on them, and it ends up trapping the perpetrators, which is justice served right there, and justice in itself. So when buildings start becoming evil, they can take on a life of their own in a sense, and I've seen this happen. Or archetypal spiritual entity will take over an entire building. And that's why people say like, oh, haunted houses, seem like they're breathing or they're alive, because there is an energy that is saturating the place and insatiating it. So buildings start becoming evil, they can take on a life of their own. In a sense, when too many spiritual doors exist, gates or portals are open and stay open, then those portals actually get bigger and get other portals, like Legion gets more and more of itself, and then it's harder to get rid of. And then it's like a black hole, and then evil ground grows larger. That's why you got to stop it at its roots. And then divine intervention has to happen to completely cauterize the system. And some places, and block entrances and exits and all that. And that's angelic work. Some places like this can even start to have the earth crack open when enough rituals and sacrifices are done in one particular location to create a vortex energy pattern, or a marking point where it becomes like a toroidal energy or standing columnar waves. And this can create a fissure in the dimensions and matter between space and time too. Mass itself starts to shift, and change and become chaotic matter, and then it becomes malleable in its form and function, because time itself is a function and a force. And a fulcrum is us, and that's a delicate balance of the spaces between all matter as everything goes through us. The Bible says we are living gateways and ancient doors. So if we're like fulcrums. Time itself is a function and a force. We filter things out, and we're supposed to filter every thought out through the mind of Christ, and every seed that can grow something good and good fruit to become a tree that is unmovable, unshakable, and can stand up against any of these things. There's a delicate balance of the spaces between all matter, and what makes matter slow down enough to become solid and then fluid and then back and forth. And the permutations can go and change their state of matter: solid, liquid, gas, walk through walls. So people in the secret space force operate in a quantum fluid realm, per se, navigating our physical masses to a calibrated function of fluid to solid, solid to fluid, and back and forth as a relay system. And we get triggered by signals and relay systems and cued. And we're timed and tested to see who can sustain this type of quantum fluxing, which in and of itself can be defined as and compartmentalized in the domain of time travel, even if the duration can be like really short or long, drawn out in longer lengths of time. Both sometimes need the activating element of extraction if the synchronicity is not well maintained and balanced and keeping harmony and a harmonious flux with the entire body, mind, spirit, psyche, soul, and consciousness apparatus driving factors. So needless to say, Bela Lugosi didn't get his painting worshipped on the walls in the dining halls as he wanted to forever, but he ended up being sealed off in pieces, mainly behind the large several tons of reinforced green door. Yes, another lifetime of silence behind the green door. This one was a double green door and double thick green door, maybe triple, in the outermost corner of the basement, straight to hell. It was a portal to hell. The rest of the mansion was laid in ruins and still is structurally rotting and falling apart as it should, and is the most fitting ending to the legacy of Vlad's worthless empire and struggle to retain its memory, Clavens, and the atrocious rule in history. So there's so many places with X-File documentations. Like Asheville, Ohio was another X-File type place in the past, and there was a traffic light there that was the first in the U.S., and this area was riddled with artificial overlay contrasts and alien nefarious activity for hundreds of years. And this particular traffic light was shaped silver like a gray alien head, and it looked like two alien eyes. And its features that would protrude out onto the streets in every direction, and a black bar would move through the lights inside like a clock, back and forth from red to yellow, and make these crazy noises, and then from yellow to green, and then sometimes many colors would just blend all together like a rainbow. And there was like a hypnotic factor that came out of this light, and a spaceship that was over this town working with that light. And then it became a stronghold, and on this firstly installed traffic light system, people would start becoming mesmerized and stand in the street and get abducted. They were getting obsessed with it, seeing the rainbow colors, the spectrums, and the frequencies. It was affecting their brainwave patterns. Many accidents started happening here, and there was this frequency emanating from the wires and cables even that was like crackling in the ground, connecting to the spaceship. And this was like low elf-like sounds that crackled through the streets even. And this became a mind control frequency throughout the town that people got used to, and abductions kept happening in this place. Strange events, disappearances, voice to skull like thought suggestions. And then the closer the people got to this crossway, the weirder their lives became. So it was eventually dealt with, waveforms canceled, and the ship and life forms causing the disturbances and jamming frequencies were taken out. And another hospital center in Missouri had what we called elevator traumas happen to the Avenger crew and travelers, mainly into the 80s, that also made them fearful of elevators for a while. There was a Cox Medical Tower that had like a relay system of charades going on. And one elevator kept breaking and one was always active on the other side of the tower. And we were at war with these internal systems of this hospital, which felt more like an experimentation Nazi hospice for super soldiers to struggle to find their last hope of escaping and breaking out into normalcy as fast as they could. There was a lot of surgeries that happened in this place, and we named this medical tower the Avengers Hospital in the 70s. And there was an underground vault system that connected to a southern bank where gold and other Nazi hoardings were kept and checked up on. And many drones were running the facility that looked like hospital workers. And they always brought us up and down stairs on these elevators to the K wing after we got off the helicopter pad, and which had like HH painted on the ground in the back. K wing for nights, where we actually jumped out the windows one time onto a lower roof. So we tried to escape through the ventilation systems also once and tried many other things when brought up to the facility after being flown via helicopter and brought in at the back of the building. And me and John were always driving up sometimes to the ramp that went to the back of the building, and then sometimes jumping off the lower ramp onto the grass and actually leaving the facility. But leaving this complex to not touch us or cut into us or harm us was a huge accomplishment at this point in time. And there was just so many things that went on with this place. But to sum it up, the last memory I had of that was trying to get everybody upstairs in this square type shape where they were being kept. I think it was on the 5th floor, out of the doors. But my legs wouldn't work right, and it felt like somebody had drilled into even the bones in my legs. So it was really painful, like 1,000 needles going into my legs, it felt like, when I was trying to walk. So I was crawling on the floor sometimes, and some of the things that they did to the super soldiers were really crazy. And most all of them, I don't think we'll ever find out the names of a lot of these types of experimental surgeries either. But by the grace of God, your brain and other parts of your body can be healed. The Marvel Cave in Branson is also named after the Marvel-like character roles some travelers played to discover the inner earth workings of this cave system. And this cover story still says that most of the cave is underwater and can't be viewed, but there's actually multiple and endless exits to this cave, especially that make it the second largest cave in America. But the hidden history is still classified as it was labeled a labyrinth and full of never-ending supernatural cases, occurrences, dead ends and loose ends, secret wars, and blown out exits to preserve the portals that were found within its complex archives. There's actually waterfalls found down there. And the outside exterior, going back to the hospital, one thing I'll also mention is that the outside of this building was so strange because it was coded into a language after we gained control of financial titles, deeds, and ownership claims, managing financial money systems. And it looked like this thick braille strips, almost Enochian languages, inscribed on every floor and the stones up to the 8th floor of the building, looming over the town. So it basically read in codex, you're nothing and your plans will never work. So it was kind of like a FU to the deep faction that was using and abusing us, that wanted the end goal of us to be outfitted permanently as drones for their faction. So the upstairs was the circle, square-like rotunda, more like. And the worst thing was just not knowing what happened to you in a room before you try to escape, not knowing what a doctor had done to you or what they had gotten away with. So every time I went up there was like a searing, burning pain in my knees and legs, deep in the bones, so you couldn't walk well. You'd have to get your vision right and forget about your legs, find a way to walk, get your bearings together, try to use whatever non-diluted faculties you had left in your mind to ensure that the others could survive with you, since you were like, am I the only one awake? And then your mind would instantly go to, I have to get the others. And that's a true soldier. Don't leave anyone left behind. And that's what the others ones would do for us. So you would want to do it for them too. And your brain would hurt and throb, but somehow with the tether of hope that I had left at this point, I'd cry out to God to not turn me into a cyborg. And then I would barely make it out of there. And then it was the final time that I did make it out of there and that we never saw that place again. And the system medical facility as it currently stands is still cursed and gross and dark and just full of sickness and disease and the smell of death in its interior passageways. And then there was other facilities that were like that, but there was another strange facility in the Simpsons town called the White Castle. And this was like a mini mall like complex that had white stone walls and lit torches on the outside and inside that were iron and black. And then a strange fire was permeating the structure. And we were brought here at night and had to wait in the stone box like structures that are now bathrooms inside before entering the other part of this building for this god awful ritual site. And there was this partition part of the business complex at the entrance that had a long black curtain drawn in front, blocking the view from the hall as each of us, one by one, were taken behind the black curtain into the hallways. Now, while we were waiting, there were these huge, large stone urn-like strange fire altars before the curtain that now I think they're using for plant holders. And those would be burning, and you'd have to look into that. And then people that we were with would try to take your hands and make you touch the fire and to be a seer for the fire. And then they would try to turn you into a seer for them. And when they put water into that afterward, it was also like a scrying pot. So they use fire and then they use water. And knowing that they had seers, they would try to turn the seers for them, to prognosticate their future or do favors for them in the dark realms. So we went down the hallway with two people, and they were like a king and queen lizard themselves. Like this was their type of event, it felt like was going on. So the queen would take the boys and girls separately into two large black mirror doors, and you couldn't see into them. And then it became like black liquid. And they even dressed up kind of like a king and queen would in like royal robes. And it wasn't impressive to us because we'd already seen this before. And people or entities like that fall. So what they were doing was sending these kids, once they got them into these rooms through the black mirror doors, to a graveyard port that they would then bring them back. And in their hands, they would have this type of soil, like a black soil, and they would put it in the large fire pot. And this place became a portal to some kind of Slavic region where ancient history was that they thought was important. And I would sit on a bench sometimes and look into the doorway arches and black mirror entrances. And then I would be able to spiritually see behind the glass. And then you could see like their real forms, like they were reptilian or fallen in nature. And they would be just staring back at you like coldly and deadly. And the other one would be handling a child in a dentist chair, and its gross fingers and hands would move close by the mirror. And you could then see details, and you could discern and see like through the whole glass itself, through the matter. And this is more than manipulating and syncing with static energy lines, which appear only as gray or silver or EM spectrums. This was breaking through all the invisible light spectrums, through black matter itself, black goo, and being able to see the full matter through it and to cut through it like a sword. So you could see through it. I could see what was in front of me, what they were going to do to me, what was going to happen, so that it give you an advantage. And you could see color that wasn't invisible anymore. So I kept this to myself and then knew what they were doing before I was called and brought into the black dentist room or doctor room. And then I saw the tools that they were using before they brought me back, and then this dentist chair where the portal was. So being able to discern in the spirit was probably the greatest gift God ever gave me, to be able to counter intuit and then wage preemptive war on the enemy and protect your mind, coupled with the gift of spiritual hearing and smelling, to also be able to know when evil things were near and then hear them and their plans and to block them out. Having strategic advantage. They were laying kids down in this dentist chair, and then the handlers had these black hands with black fingernails, and we called them time shifters too. But they were operating some sort of royal black gate to an ancient graveyard of their ancestors, and then disposing of and trapping victims in this White Castle facility in the back alley that was also blocked off and had these hanging vines and these big black iron fences back there, and then a small wooded area behind that. So the operation didn't work as they planned eventually, and they couldn't use us as liaisons or couriers for them anymore, and we didn't allow them to use us to get things for them in time. And they wanted certain objects, or for us to be like their recon agents or retrieval for certain systems they knew about and we weren't interested in. And for us to go into places where they couldn't morph into or genetically be allowed to walk through in the time corridors. Because obviously they needed us, because something would happen to them if they went to all these places. I would go too far forward sometimes or backwards in times. But then I could use that to throw them off and then jump myself or blink in and out of time, kind of phasing myself in and out and confuse them. So I'd be in that dentist chair, blink in, and see a modern dentist sometimes working on my teeth at another point in time, and then blink again and be in another time and see the fallen ones still standing around me, trying to hack into my brain with silver tools in their hands, which were resonators actually, like ancient Egyptian like resonators, like tuning forks, but they had a ball on the end. And then I could blink in again and be in their ancient location, going back and forth in this timeline until I could figure out how to jump at the perfect moment in aperture mode and go full bright, fully phase and phase lock the sequence to knock them off their timeline and shut and seal them out of their own stronghold graveyard and black mirror ports. That was locking kids into their agenda, their false futures, and messing with their destinies through fear, manipulation, and other different modalities. Somehow they use these hand resonator shafts with the balls at the end of them to scan our minds, and it would cause the two halves of our brains to feel like they were splitting up, like a tuning fork vibration, but way different and much more stronger. So we learned how to use free will and mental willpower, zeal and vigor that enabled spiritual and physical melding to occur, and that was the only sure thing to utilize all of your senses and abilities in one body at one given time and not let them separate any part or parcel of you, and to keep yourself as a straight arrow hitting that mark and intention and purpose driven force that you could generate from within your own self, and then get to that destination point to knock their recurve off and then have recursive efforts be initiated to be able to blow them out of the water. So we blindsided these entities a lot as they underestimated kids. This became a weakness of theirs, and it was like unpackaging a bomb inside a child's body that changed the very fabric of the reality around you and then woke up the other teammates. Like a domino effect, chain reaction. And the king and queen of the White Castle had no more power over us as we overcame their chair and White Castle mall lockdown. And the names of the future medical offices became odd over time, like Dr. Hader, Horton's Smile Place, and other encoded names into the offices. And names and things like that are just so bizarre, and seeing things change in time that's not quite like the Mandela effect, but a little bit similar, all has to do with the quantum domain. Coffeeville, Coffinville, the Dead Zone, Radio Springs, and other villages were also little files of secret victories and post graveyards of ancient things. The Treadstone series has some truth as well about the assassins known as cicadas. And this also had to do with Assassin's Creed and woken up and activated persons. And then a black swarm like locusts would be in flight doing exactly what they're told is the purpose of the Treadstone file and the Treadstone series. And Blackbriar was the programming code behind the cicadas. They wanted a team to be like these evil, ugly-looking bugs that all acted upon the same hive-like sounds, getting louder and stronger like a tree full of cicadas do, and then how they sound. But the only pretty thing a cicada has is that one type upside down on its wings looks like a lion's face. So we broke that protocol and programming it as it was insulting in what they called cicada protocol, cicada covenant, and we changed their patterns, our patterns, what we're capable of initiating, uninstalling, installing, and ending up turning the whole system upside down, and the parameters and programming functions on its back. So, and turning the tables. Because they wanted you to just be sleeper cells and asleep and turned upside down, dormant and quiet. And when they wanted you, they could just flip you over and activate you, and it wouldn't be favorable for you. So we turned it on them, so it wasn't favorable for them or a good outcome. Haven is another file that has some truth to it in the rabbit hole of intellectual property vaults. And Haven, Maine was an occult-ridden place with a chamber in the bottom of a lighthouse dedicated to Cthulhu and Marine Kingdom worship. And this is very H.P. Lovecraft type stuff, like an ancient Viril Thule Society that went underground. And this connected and continued some of the dark files of Montauk Project, Plum Island, and the underwater sea base events and research facilities. So these files were in conjuncture and concurrently flowing with each other, and things were preserved and scattered throughout many secret and hidden deep bases as extensions of Hydra. So Mara was my evil altar's name, created by my grandfather Mickey during a large event at a Masonic temple when I broke and was severely fragmented, and chosen as the child to continue in a presidential monarch programming after one night. Agent Howard was an extraterrestrial holding space in a barn structure that was interdimensional in the inside, and a memory storage unit I could mesh with and heal in over periods of time, as everything in here was perfectly filled, perfectly sterilized, and fully whole, restored, preserved, and functional in memory banks, data archives, holotech, and medbed-like healing equipment and cellular recompositioning abilities. So it's like a almost like a mummification, but it's way more life-giving than that. We were given sanctions here, allotments, time rooms of our own, libraries, and it was an interdimensional holding space for the deepest wounds, lacerations, pockets, gulfs, and cliffs in your own being could just kind of come together and heal. And you could process space battles, secret space file missions, and anything in between could be spoken of, addressed, speaking freely and at liberty to speak, processed, and remain in closure and confidence. And this is where our identities were dumped, where new identities were gained, where crafts were aligned with the barn space and kept the exterior appearance out of the perception gaps of common folk. So there was cloaking technology there too. And the real-time barn was in Missouri, and it vibed quite beautifully for a long time in a field of sunflowers and daisies. But when too many people were involved with these delicate USAPs, unacknowledged secret access programs, the barn itself had to be destroyed and erased from time, and the information storage sent off-world, and some remaining with intelligence as black files. And the place we met for coffee was nicknamed the Barn Sands, like the sands of time. So Debris is also a file about pocket dimensions, uncoiled, unrolled, uncoiled, again, categorized, observed, put back together, compartmentalized, and revealed in their unfoldings. So this helped researchers in the USAPs to wrap their minds around the influx and outflux shape of what composes this universe and structures within the universe as fabrics, and how closely we are with universal laws in our daily walk, and so much so that it's like a membrane around us. That's why Christ said the kingdom of heaven is within. Utter annihilation exists without the door of Yahushua, though, because he says he stands at that door always. He is the only truth, the way, and the life, who holds the uniformity and all uniform patterns together in cohesion and way beyond the human residence or anything, because all creation comes from his heart. So he says, seek my face and my heart. It's where unity comes from, his creator design, cohesiveness of all the designs in the mind of Christ come together. It's all imprinted into him as the first fruits of humanity and the head of the human race and creator. That's why he talks about his creation as he's the gardener and he weeds us and grows us, and we sow the seeds that we have within us. And the ability that we have to speak life and give life, and out of our stomachs flow an abundance of life and living waters. So we're just hardwired and designed to have this communion with the creator and to understand creation. All things flow back into the heart of the creator. And without acceptance of that, chaos will ensue and take the driver's seat, and the end of one's life. Without their creator, it's just outer darkness and destruction and annihilation. So this file was about debris scattered across the world from motherships that were consciously linked to individuals and uplinks and other ways to have access to people who had become quantumly entangled with these ships and traveled with them and their pieces of debris in the time continuum. So they became like lab rats in a maze of a fragmented ship itself. And this is a very bizarre file that was complex and unstable and scary for many months. And people don't understand some anomalies in space are like Nibiru, it itself being a piece of tech from the 80s when the Anunnaki came that is orbiting in reverse. Now, the pieces of the ship debris read the intent of the people who interacted with it, much like a medbed can also read your mind as you sync with it. It read their life force and much more about them that met the eye. So the forecast and point of exit landing was determined in the color prisms and shapes and patterns that were excluded when the reality shifted interdimensionally around them and the area. And this is the part where the boy and girl, go underwater and then lay in a piece of a spaceship. This was then timed to precision to get a certain mapping or coding of predicting the ship's capabilities and outcomes as it interplayed with these humans and spit them out in alternative timelines, like a game to get them back to reset point and then starting over until they got it right. So it was done through a series of high resonance vibrations so that you could become a standing columnar wave yourself and then maintain that. And the main two causes of these aberrations were twins named Sophia and Sean, involving three main states of triangular liftoff: Wisconsin, Missouri, and Washington. Oceanside site, black site. So they were these two kids were continually jumping off this cliff, hoping to get different results each time until they realized time was the key factor, function, and force. They then in alternate boxed off visible bleed through timelines in front of each other, which were living, moving, breathing different realities, agreed to jump back onto the ship debris in the ocean at the exact same time to cancel out any alternative timelines or realities and get the dimensions back to 0 point, and then get them all back to the starting point as each jump changed the variables and lives of each individual, making it worse. So this was used to further the time travel program in the end, and then the participants were not lost. The tech that read these signatures was even upgraded to avoid a catastrophic event if this breach in space-time ever occurred again, and the participants were stabilized, anchored, and back in the solid state, one identity, one station in time, synced back on track. So they went from fluid states to going through matter that's picked up as atmospheric disturbances in some readers and some scanners and signature hunting tech that's out there. Atmospheric disturbances. So they went from static time and then had to gather loose ends later. They got back into static time, then had to gather loose ends later from the consequences of all the past jumps. So there's always, for every action, there's a consequence, a reaction. So sometimes you had to go back and kind of like smooth out a jagged series of events that you had caused, a series of unfortunate events, and try to smooth that over and make it straight. So many unknown probabilities were created when the twins went their own ways and didn't get team intervention until the end points of certain things they created when left to their own devices. So they kind of dug themselves in a hole, and it got worse and worse. And then they needed to work as a team in order to fully all go to the same point, cancel out certain waves, and sink back to zero. Kind of like a combination lock, but 7 people doing it all at once at the exact same time and getting back to zero. So there were quantum strings and interfaces, interferences, and knots that had to be corrected and smoothed over because of all the past jumps, because the future correlations with other cells were still unknown and how scenarios would play out. So you can't control your own free will in the future is the thing. Only in the present given moment you can, that you live in right now. I can choose to do whatever I want right now. So there's always reverberations to these choices, and like a ricochet sometimes that comes back to slap you in the face years later when you're hopping through time. The point is to ground the optimal timeline and coherent resonance peaks, which inadvertently brings those prior jumps back into order, even if those jumps were only observational and non-interactional. So then you create a crest of a wave that you can ride on smoothly and that other people can follow and identify and be able to visually see. Math was done to see how they aligned themselves in the craft and the matter affected. And they somehow created a singularity, and the pieces of the craft had a sentience to it in which it used to collect itself and then tried to rebuild itself with. It had the same behaviors as black goo and buckyballs do, ferrous fluid, but it was way, way stronger than that. So the pieces had to be separated from the rest of the pieces as they seemed to be calling out to each other in a magnetic resonance and pull. So it couldn't be destroyed, as minuscule pieces would start to rebuild themselves, and the whole process started all over again, like a Terminator melting and building a body again. So then all these pieces of debris started collecting themselves again and building a barrier wall around a city, like a psychonaut. Black matter body was forming and then started walking around and was seen walking down the roads and in the woods. So basically the chaotic energy anchored itself into the reality. And then the people in the town started seeing like a static form of like black matter that was like phasing in and out, but looked like a shape of a man walking, but it would phase in and out and not retain one solid form. And it was kind of electrical looking too, or smoky in nature. So this form that was created was like a buildup of black static matter, like smoke, that was phasing in and out of the visible light spectrum, waiting to have the ship rebuilt so its body could get stronger and take the ship into its control. Now, all of these things that try to take form in reality like this are all consciousness driven. They all have consciousness and they're consciousness based, because consciousness is different from a spirit or a soul or a mind. It's like a radio frequency, actually. So they want bodies. It seemed to be taking form through openings, collections of antimatter from holes opening up in the dimensions, and then it was able to manifest in our walking 3D reality-scapes and scope. So the Oceanside site in Washington became a pocket dimension in itself, and you could see clouds forming over it that were not normal clouds, like quantum clouds, and dimensions shifting in and of themselves, like rotating. It almost looked like it was wanting to become a tesseract, but a cloud-like in nature. You could see manifestations of the punched holes in a reality around it and in its rooms, bubble-like formations, and these appeared as cubes and waves, which were tighter squares holding the other selves and their forms within those cubes, containing them in a space, static in time. And the alternate dimensions and realities that they were seeing inside of this house and their bodies inside of those cubes were being kept within those squares, those cubes, and then keeping them apart from their original self in a space like a buffer zone until the timelines were all dealt with, like quantum strings waiting to be arranged or cut or put together or completed in some form. Somebody had to come in and do something with all of this, like solving the quantum puzzle. So it looked like suspended, these people in their cubes were suspended in time waves. And these squares were like time walls with colors and interdimensional windows inside of them that you could communicate to your other self with. And they were somewhat solid yet transparent and taking interdimensional shapes, but they had just echoes inside, like distant echoes if you would hear yourself talk in the other cube. So they're taking interdimensional shapes like a kaleidoscope of mapped out points or probabilities, and they were just sitting there in cubes looking back at you. Live mirrors, other selves, spaces between the matter, and mirror molecules holding quantum reflections. So then what happens next? You have to pick the optimal choice. The response teams lost a lot of time and data and security in their efforts to secure the whole, which you can see from space now, from an aerial footage. And it took several attempts, getting 11 out of the way first, because she was tracking this event with tech and other operatives who were put in play. And then winning, you had to win this scenario by consciousness retention. That was the main key factor, which takes brain elasticity. Everyone else lost their memories most of the time, except for the twins who retained the events of each loop dozens of times over. So they had the winning advantage each time. And once they made sharp, calculated guesses, which led them to the correct decisions to collapse the other event horizons and timelines, the entire oceanside whole was then neutralized, the tech retrieved, and the place quarantined and sealed off for decades. Another place the twins were working together was called the workshop, and we called it the workship. And there's 2 floorboards there that held a stargate in the ground that went way back to 211 AD after Christ into the High Middle Ages and the mystery of 9 in between. But unfortunately, history was mostly erased in 2 AD, 1001 to 1100. Binary codex, 6 portals and gates came through here, this place, and then the forecasts of 1966, 6612. 12 hallways were represented in the sculptures that created this workshop space. And that is a very, very fringe file, and that is the only synopsis I can give as an outline right now. So the doors were nicknamed Sean Connery and Alpha Dogs. And this was by the Time Barn, and a place where all the files were debriefed with the loops of those who were involved at a place we called the Sands of Time. So another weird correlation to all this is that the Village Inn diners also had MyLab incidents happen there at both locations in this town. And orange lights would come in and flood the place, and sounds and permeate the diner. And orange light would just fill the whole room, just go around in a circle. And the tech in the walls and bulbs were also infused, and they infused the place and welcomed this kind of activity in with so many strange happenings here and nights. And for some reason, the whole place would smell like urine afterwards, and people's memories would get erased, and they'd lose time. They'd get lost finding their way home. But then they'd always come back the next day, though, and have the same thing or eat the same pie. And what's weird is that buildings themselves can be structured and wired to facilitate these activities. And circuitry can also have an impact on our brain's electromagnetism and ability to react and respond appropriately to dangers and threats involved, instead of just sitting there and entertaining them. Because circuitry itself can be sigils, and they can be hardwired to create an environment and mess with our brain patterns. So the Village Inn became a hotspot for entertaining alien activity and walk-ins and people. So there was a burial lot in the backyard of one of these places, and a fence put up afterwards, and then UFO encounters kept repeating. in like these loops, and it ties in also with times of Abraham Lincoln trying to find the best pie in America. And two of the village inns here were built on old establishments that Lincoln actually owned. And you'd be really surprised how many encounters and incidents have been reported involving alien phenomena and Abraham Lincoln, cornfields, and other stuff like that, as well as other presidents too. So going on, one place our clones were taken to is called Uncle Bentley's, and there these clones received treatments and bioidentical hormone replacement therapies and various skin treatments. And one time, a female filler of mine didn't receive the right proportion of hormones and went ballistic and raging. And she looked like Linda from The Evil Dead that was slammed into the basement cellar. But it wasn't a basement cellar like they show in the movie. She was contained, dragged outside on the steps into this old stone building in the back of the skin clinic that had an outside wine cellar opening with those old wooden doors that opened up outside, and put down there. And there was a sign in the lawn with these women that would flash on the screen with perfect skin, but they had black eyes, and it would say the fillers. So the place was kind of haunting and very creepy. And across the street from here was an RLDS Community of Christ that had some of the clones electroshocked outside. And this was done in a large steel fence area facing the woods that had barbed wire on top of the outdoor fencing. And they said that they needed so much of this fencing, it looked just like dog kennels set up on both sides, really tall, just to protect the central air that was outside. Or they made up some excuse, but they had about 6 of them on each side lined up like human dog kennels facing outdoors straight from the doors of the church. And near here was a 1960s mini mall connected to an abandoned theater, which is now a present-day Korean church that was an ex-RC Cola cloning center that children were also trafficked through. And there was an alley between the spaces of these buildings that was overgrown with vines, and it was an entrapment area where a reptilian man was and a white van. He would chase you through here to trap you through there, and then a white van would be on the other side of this alley, and you were squeezed through this blind spot between the buildings, kind of sandwiched in there, and taken in the back alley where that van had a door open. And now it's called, back then it was called Chesterfield Square McLean Enterprises. And similar to this was Pig and Bun. Kids were referred to as pigs sometimes, and the old Italian villa turned Mexican villa was a crime scene and trafficking hub as well. And this was like a mafia zone in one spot with a drugging dentist bringing kids over to the villa right across the street. And this became a mission to rescue kids as well. So you'd see a Mexican boy painted on the side, hiding his face on the side of the building, like in loneliness. And then on the other side, you'd see a man painted on a horse. And many times you'd be chased on the side of this part past that mural, ironically. And then there's these neon lights that were flashing and haunting at night, the dentist's house across the street, and then this quiet park that no one ever went to on the other side. And then behind that, there was an outside trailer-like portion of the restaurant where the ringleader was sometimes, and strange cars were always coming and going out of the parking lot. A couple other ones were built in town. Some of them had a whole lot of RVs in the backyard. But the big one was like a temple, and it had dragons and Mayan and Aztec gods everywhere inside. And the weird thing is that this one had pictures of missing children right when you walked in. And Kodak photos from the old cameras that were hanging from the ceiling, just of random places, but they were actually bragging about what they did. There was a portal to Juarez there and drugged Coca-Cola that would ensure that the listed kids got taken into the back and then through the back door parking lot or taken in an RV, never to be seen again. And the scenery on the walls was very overwhelming. Like, it was very nauseous. It's like you were being brought back into a dragon's mouth in the main temple-like Mexican villa, back into certain back rooms awaiting your fate. And there was pictures of actual places as part of this hub on the walls at one point, and a mural of a woman that was actually in Mexico that's part of this operation, looking out a window, hanging up laundry on a clothes wire outside. because they would take the kids' clothes and then hang them up outside like that, hanging up their dirty laundry as part of the process and the way that they did things down there. So they hung up clothing from people involved in this operation right on the ceiling there too. So Great Scott, Fort Scott. Bloody Kansas struck again. The Back to the Future file originated here, and the military fort was invaded by an off-world Ishtar faction with dragon-like entities that thought they were imperial too. They came up from this well and took over some military personnel and then infected one whole fort and units one by one. The Hotel of Strife was named there, which surmounted from many battles there, many secret wars, and became bloody steps over and over again. And the square of Fort Scott housing unit was also a tighter square. And we went rounds with the interdimensional people there. And there was these hideous long red curtains with green walls that became really sickening over time. So many attacks were planned there, and the mission had counterattacks and how to win time wars with this faction. And it became a game of Foursquare and 5D chess. So the lead dragon, the Dragoon, was finally dealt with in his red room, and the other Dragoons were these shorter and smaller and little men, and they carried these old lanterns that were filled with some sort of like black oil that they needed for sustenance that they put on their skin and that they drank, and they got from the well. So there was a city scale rotunda building that we joked about because it actually said scales on it, city scales, about the scales being on the army, like lizard scales. So these little dragoons wore these funny black hats with feathers on them and slept on a sideways big slab that was just long enough for their feet to touch and their head. So they were like little robots, so that if they had to wake up or switch shifts, like the goons that they were, they would be just ready to jump up and push each other up and stand guard. And their helmets bore the star of Ishtar and the star of Raphaim, which God detests, Raphaim of the Old Testament. And there was a matriarchal and patriarchal dragon presence at Fort Scott that took over. And the patriarch was actually the last one to go. There were many fires there. There's a situation strategy room that became a spying room to gain details of how the minds of the body snatchers worked, which is also green. There was green doors there too. There's a Tesla coil put in the middle of the square, and a grounding rod, and lightning would strike so many times in the square that we just lost track of even counting. And the battles became intense. The clocks of time were repeatedly turned back and forward and paused there. And the city hall on the corner even became a black portal door that you just go in and out of and in and out of and disappear. And the basis of that clock on top of that city hall building became struck by lightning once, like in Back to the Future, but it was much shorter. It was just a red brick building. And we went to this red brick city hall building, disappeared countless times in this mission. Across the street from this was the worst Scottish Rite Masonic temple I've ever seen in my life. It was worse than Joplin, Missouri. And this one had a humongous stone wings on the outside that were big, long black wings to certain cubits, certain measurements, just very satanic. And it had double-headed eagles on the globe holding a black globe. And that actually, their symbolism on the outside, which is like big Anunnaki wings, got struck by lightning at the end. And it was so cool. It had a huge X split right down the center of it, right down the claws that were holding the globe of the dirty birds, and the 33 number there, denoting that their authority had been shattered in this region, and they were all sent back to the void that they came from. So this was an internal battle in the lodge itself that seemed to blow up on itself to combust. And divine intervention happened here in this lodge and saved the day. And the lightning actually shot out from within this lodge, and it was like ball lightning that came out. And it shot out onto the main street and the corners, purifying their toxic frequencies and all the mind control and everything that had been going on there that they were sending out relentlessly. And the control grids dropped, and the Dragoon troops died. So this was like white Elohim lightning that created this ball lightning out of that shot out of their beloved symbols, and then that shot electricity like out onto telephone poles and left this piezoelectric glow and smell of ozone in the atmosphere instead. And that it completely changed the state of this poor town back to neutral, like setting it back to zero. And their symbols on the temple, these were marred then, and they haven't been fixed since. They're not allowed to fix them. These were ancient like wing makers and an Anunnaki faction that breached the entire regiment of Fort Scott, and it was a great secret battle there. I mean, in one part, the floor even split into two places, and the chimney split in half in the last battle with this big entity there, the Alpha Dragoon, because its tail smashed into many layers of the stone floor and made this crevice. And the chimney, where strange fire and sacrifices were being altered, split too. And it went way down into the wooden floorboards, almost taking out the whole upstairs of this building. And this male, the same male, was coming up at night to this room and reading these maps by candlelight at night and these scrolls and exchanging scrolls and information, intel, and was acting as like a courier, almost as if he was doing it off-world, in this off-worldly manner too, very secretive. And we caught him doing these behaviors at night and followed him back to the well. And the place eventually got neutralized, became a museum, and the blood square, as we called it, because everything was drenched in blood at one time there. So it is now a quiet, eerie plot of the town. And another tighter square is in the cemetery of Yekaterinburg, Russia, but that's another story and part of Operation Werewolves.